Good evening, ladies and honorable. I'm glad that you've joined this early. Honorable, I'm sending you an invitation to be a speaker. So you'll just have to accept it and then you'll be able to speak. Honorable, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir, loud and clear.
Okay, that's great. We just
You are on and off.
okay. Honorable, I just said we are going to wait like for 3 minutes to have other people joining us. But in the meantime, as we wait for that, I could pick your mind on the Kenyan elections in case you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so what do you make of the happenings in Kenya? How the election is conducted, the voter turnout, and everything that you can make of it, really, as a member, as a former member of parliament.
Maybe in limine, I should also officially state that I am still a member of Parliament of East Africa, at least
Sorry
up to
about that.
December of this year. What I can say about the voter turnout, it is very clear. When you look at the historicity of Kenyan elections, they have been a high voltage activity, majorly because the protagonists have been almost ethnic leaders, and that ethnic nationalism has been guiding. It was the guiding principle, guiding the turnout of elections for purposes that now, ethnically, each and every entity would like to lead. But when you look at it, is because it looks like what happened. For example, you remember when the BPI was being rolled out, the Honorable Raila Odinga gave an analysis of how they, again, that they sat down and recollected all the insults they had all gone through, all the upheavals they had each gone through. And that is Raila Odinga on one part, and of course Uhuru Kenyatta and Ruto on the other. And the question he posed, in his opinion, was, when did the rain begin to beat us? To me, that certainly was a very pregnant question that he posed. And clearly what he meant was, there is an undertone that has been existent, that probably the dichotomy of Kenyan politics was the Luos on the one part that must not lead, and the Kikuyu on the other part opposing such leadership, to the extent that preferences would then be of the Kalenjin or the Kikuyu, Mutatis Mutandis. Now, today, when you find that the incumbent president coming from the Kikuyu tribe is actually vending an opposition candidate coming from the Luo tribe, the question of where the rain had begun to beat them was almost solved. So apathetically, voters did not think they were mobilized enough by way of protest support to come up and vote. Number two, when you look at the two candidates, for example, the two leading candidates, William Ruto is the incumbent deputy president. He is campaigning and promising heaven on earth. Now the population are aware that he did not deliver that heaven on earth, yet he had a substantial power in the government that is outgoing. Number two, the voters are looking at Mzee Raila Odinga as in the administration of Kenya. I hope I'm still being audible. I am getting a bit of interruption by way of person is calling.
Yeah, you're audible. We can still hear you.
Yes. So when the population now begin to look at the two candidates, they just look more of the same. That even Mzee Raila Odinga on the one part has been an active participant in the administration. He cannot promise heaven on earth except if historically he has been known to have brought it closer. So apathetically, I think the voters think that the two candidatures are more of the same and that the Kenyan politics is beginning to look like a politics based on issues majorly than practically what had been the case in terms of only ethnic groups.
Okay. Finally, I want to your final question in that regard before we begin the discussion. How does the happening in Kenya, for instance, you're seeing the internet is on, the police has not arrested any candidate. And when you compare and contrast that with the elections that we have, for instance, in Uganda, what does that say about the dream of having a united East African community?
Yeah, having a united East African community is one of the most fantastic dreams, and that is a very worthwhile dream. However, actualizing the same is still a logical impossibility given the current types of leaderships that we have. However, I would like you to isolate the kind of lessons that we need to learn from Kenya. Today, I was somewhere discussing the same topic, and I told the Ugandans that we can only benchmark our own processes to the process of electoral processes in 1991 of Kenya. We cannot compare ourselves to the current Kenya, but we can compare ourselves to the Kenya of 1991. The Kenya that was still dealing with Moi, and a Moi that was still incumbent upon freeing political parties, and that freedoms of such parties had not yet been actualized by 1991. However, a law had been enacted in 91, and effectually parties got registered, and by 1992, they were then free to participate in political activities, yet they had not grown to capacity enough for purposes of obtaining leadership from the Kanu that had stayed in power for quite some time. So that is how you need to look at it. And any lessons that we learn must be for purposes of organizing ourselves constitutionally and or otherwise to the extent that the future then will hold what Kenya is enjoying right now.
Okay, thank you, Honorable. Now, for those that have just joined us, my name is Godwin Toko. I am your moderator, one of the moderators, tonight. I'm going to be joined by a young lady called Sandra Kopp, and we are going to have a conversation that is different from the one we've just been having. We engage in that one to buy time. Honorable, I'm going to request that you mute your microphone.
Okay, much obliged. Let me do so. I had again some disturbance.
Okay. So the conversation we're going to have today is a look at the DP NRM agreement, or the one that some people have protestingly called the Mao Museveni agreement, that was signed a few weeks back. So we have here a celebrated member of the Democratic Party, a member of the East African Community Parliament, who is going to touch some light here and there and answer some of the questions you'll put to him. And I hope that you too will have questions to put before him. So just for the record, this discussion is sponsored by PLA, the PALU Africa, and the main organizer is here with us. I see her here, Rebecca. We welcome you all that have joined us, and our lead speaker today is going to be Hon Mukasa Mbidde, whom I will put several questions to. So without further ado, let's get into the discussion that we are here for. The DP NRM, or the Mao Museveni agreement, as some termed it, and the Honorable will help us to clarify on that later as we go on. So, Honorable, the first thing I would want to know about this agreement is, what is your position on the agreement, and were you consulted in relation to the same? Honorable, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. First of all, thank you very much for the question. In limine, let me first of all correct the kind of impression that had been generated, that this is a Mao Museveni agreement and that accordingly, specific memberships of the party are at liberty to digress from the objects for which it was entered into. Now, that is not correct. This is an agreement by the Democratic Party with the National Resistance Movement and all of those and sundry that are under the governance of the Constitution of the Democratic Party have no other option but to kowtow to the provisions of that agreement. In the event that anyone wishes to object and hold contrary opinions, then of course factors and combinations and organs are provided for purposes that then they can raise contrary opinions under that order. So it is not by choice that one is agreeing to the agreement. It is an agreement by the Democratic Party. I am the vice president of the Democratic Party, and accordingly, I am with the Democratic Party in all intents and purposes with this agreement.
Okay. Now, part of those who opposed that agreement tended to say that they were not consulted. How much consultation did the leadership of the party do, to the best of your knowledge, before getting into the agreement?
You know, it sounds rather preposterous that anybody goes public against an agreement for want of consultation in a manner that that person has also not consulted the party for purposes of taking a contrary view. But what I would tell you is that the Democratic Party is coached in terms of leadership by way of organs. It has got its organs of leadership. The key organ that is headed by the president is the National Executive Committee. Now, that National Executive Committee, by operation and by the decisions that have been taken by way of precedent, has established, or it established, a subcommittee of the National Executive Committee, termed the Management Committee of the party. It is incumbent upon all of those listening to also know that the quorum of the National Executive Committee is 11 people, and the subcommittee of NEC is above the quorum of the National Executive Committee. Therefore, that committee is capable of taking decisions in one limb. The second limb is that when you look at the constitution of the Democratic Party, particularly Article 27, the president has powers to commit the Democratic Party, either expressly or impliedly, into any direction of decision making, subject to further ratification as and when the organ of the party called the National Executive Committee sits. However, the president did not choose to take that direction, but to consult the party, and a uniform decision was therefore taken that a cooperation of that nature is entered into. We have the National Council, which is the legislative body of the party, and the Delegates Conference, which is the ultimate body that is the directing mind and the will of the party, that even creates another leadership as and when it is necessary. So the party was consulted, but consultations have not yet ceased. The window generated by that article that I cited, Article 27, creates a general rule that whatever is not expressly rejected by the party, but decided upon by the president, is impliedly accepted until the party takes a contrary decision under the National Executive Committee, which decision has not been taken to the contrary, and accordingly, what is provided in the agreement between the Democratic Party and the National Resistance Movement applies pari passu. So the president consulted, and accordingly, a decision of that nature is still obtained in the party.
Okay, there have been previous, perhaps more loose agreements between members of the DP, the Democratic Party, and the ruling party. We go back to the agreement, for instance, made by in the 90s by the Semogereres and the DP that got them working with the movement system then. What do you make of that? What, from that history, what did you learn that then guided you going forward in this agreement, if any?
Incidentally, it is not true that the Democratic Party has ever entered into an agreement with the National Resistance Movement, except this agreement. This is the first of its nature.
Okay.
Historically, and of course, what now members need to listen to is that we have the current leader of the Democratic Party carrying the title of the President General, the Honorable Norbert Mao. He is the only president of DP that had not been a minister. And historically, these members agitating against a decision that he took are not raising out such a matter in a manner that I am doing so. In fact, people were wondering how he was able to do it. And except the late Benny Chiwanuka, all the other presidents were actually ministers of this current government. But none of them served by way of an agreement. They only served under the opportunistic decisions of working with a new set of administration in contemplation of solving problems of Uganda. And I think they have got the benefit of the doubt. But because they entered without agreements, they started coming out one by one and leaving a whole chunk of membership of the Democratic Party intact. And the president of the Republic of Uganda, as he then was and he now is, simply used the membership that had been taken to the National Resistance Movement without agreement as the protective wall of what he dubbed the National Resistance Movement as it became a party ultimately, and that was now a predatory measure of how, of course, the NRM worked at the time. Today, this is by agreement. The president of the party holds the key to the entry and exit into government. And that entry is even dated. We know that the president of the Republic of Uganda cannot wake up and for example, sack him, because then that marks the end of the agreement. And I can tell you that this is the first of its kind. Ideally, the president of Uganda had high affinity of signing agreements with the major fighting forces. This is the first agreement that the president of Uganda, of course, and the NRM party, is signing with a political entity that is not actually in the bush fighting. So this is the first of its kind. However, leaders of the Democratic Party started working with the NRM long ago without any substantial agreement on any of the issues than it is with the Honorable Norbert Mao and his administration.
Okay. If you could have observed, there's been a different arrangement. I don't want to call it agreement. There's been a second arrangement between the Uganda People's Congress and the NRM that has seen them work together, more also in the manner that I think the DP will work with the NRM. If you were to credit that agreement and to give it from a score of 1 to 10, what would you give it?
Which agreement? Because I have told you, my brother,
about the one of UPC and NRM, from what you've observed.
I am watching and seeing the inclusion of certain members of Uganda People's Congress into the NRM government. But I am not aware of a single agreement that was expressly entered into by the NRM and the Uganda People's Congress. However, I am seeing that the status quo ante is before, of course, the inclusion of such membership, and the status quo after the inclusion of such membership into the NRM government is different. And the NRM government has not reneged or even amended the statute of those that were included in the government. For example, when it comes to election for Yala members, the UPC member most likely has been consistently elected, not based on an agreement though that the public or Uganda is aware of, but I can see that there is a sentiment towards the likelihood that President Museveni probably thinks that any agreements that were entered into without express measures, because I am sure, and I think I can take this to the bank, that the Uganda People's Congress never wrote or entered into any agreement. But whatever they entered into, which is a convenient mechanism of working together, I find it still continuous. I think that is the spirit that one would use to also say that probably had they reduced their cooperation into an agreement, I think.
Okay, thank you, Honorable. For those that have just joined us, I'm hosting Honorable Mukasa Mbidde, a member of the East African Legislative Assembly, the Vice President of the Democratic Party of Uganda, and we are looking at the recently signed agreement between the National Resistance Movement, led by its President and Chairman, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni on the one hand, and the DP President General, Honorable Norbert Mao. So we have with us the Vice President of the Democratic Party, and we're putting questions to him. At some point, I'll ask for questions from the audience, and you can make a question, comment, or say anything that you want to say, as long as you're respectful in regard to the subject of discussion. Now, we'll continue with the discussion for about 45 minutes, then I'll bring you on. So let me go back to the Honorable. Honorable, which clause in that agreement are you excited you the most, or the one that you point out and say, this is where we nailed it the best?
Not simply a particular clause, but I can tell you that when you look at the clauses of the agreement, the clause that includes working together between the Democratic Party and the National Resistance Movement for purposes of obtaining national consensus, that is a clause that is respectful enough that the Democratic Party, with all its values and objects, I think should koto. Then the other one of respect and promotion of democratic principles, the respect for human rights, including the rights enshrined in the normative instruments that are both international and regional. You are aware that, first of all, the Uganda is enjoined to respect rights under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And that charter established under a protocol for the establishment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. You know, my brother, as an advocate, that Ugandans are not allowed to sue for purposes of obtaining redress against trampling upon their own rights before the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Why? Because Uganda has not deposited a declaration allowing them to do so. Now, when you look at the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, particularly Article 8, Capital A, and it states clearly in very certain terms that the national objectives and the directive principles of state policy of the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda are part of the Constitution. Now, Objective 28 is respect for treaty obligations. Now, when an agreement is entered into by the Democratic Party for purposes of fostering respect for treaty obligations, in my opinion, that is exciting enough. As a person who is actually so interested in the implementation of the law of treaties, I am extremely happy that the president appended the signature to a kind of that nature. The other one, I think, is that a management process headed by the Democratic Party for purposes of obtaining a transition. In my opinion, transition is what is extremely necessary in Uganda. I told you that we are looking at a benchmark process between Uganda and Kenya in terms of politics. That Uganda is behind Kenya to a tune of 1991, when now the then Moi, that had run a one-party state for quite some time, forced by the obtaining conditions of the time, and that was, I think, between the G8 then, as it had arranged itself, and the requirement that these African countries badly needed grants and loans. You remember, and I have heard a lot of people say, for example, in Uganda, that political parties were freed because some people went to court in Uganda. Others are espousing the notion that actually political parties were freed because we went for a referendum. Now, that is not true. We know that political parties became a requirement for purposes of freedoms simply because African countries necessarily needed to acquire loans and grants before the G8. You remember that, therefore, major economic activities that had been, of course, developed by 4 major presidents. One of them that had also emerged with an economic activity, all trying to access grants and loans before the G8, was orchestrated by the President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, as he then was. Another one was coached by President Obasanjo of Nigeria. The other one was coached by President Abdoulaye Wade of Senegal, as he then was. And the other one of Algeria, who was, of course, President Bouteflika. When they all met at Kananask and met the G8, they were told to consolidate their programs into one major economic program, which became the Africa Action Plan. That is the history that we know, that they were now required to free parties as one of the qualifications for such grants. So freedom of political parties by these African leaders at the time were not intended to allow the political parties to participate in the politics of their countries for purposes of obtaining change or even transitions, but to qualify for loans. So you have political parties registered in countries, but you have never had a multi-party political dispensation obtaining in those countries. That is what happened in Kenya 1991. A law was enacted in parliament for freedom of parties. 1992, they started participating, but it took them quite some bit of time before they actually realized obtaining power by way of organization. So when the Democratic Party signs an agreement that has got the effect of generating growth of political organizations, growth of the relative political maturity of the masses. And I can tell you, in Uganda, you see, when you have got one leader leading for over 35 years, there develops bias. And the bias now becomes the moving swan song on the lips of all of those politicians. There is bias for purposes of those that are with him. They are protecting him with almost axiomatic faith. But there is bias of those opposing him, that they are also opposing him without questionable values. I can tell you that you cannot underestimate the idea of bias. When you look at a political party like the Democratic Party entering into an agreement with the National Resistance Movement, so at the subconscious level of the brains of those opposing it, they are not saying that the Honorable Norbert Mao is doing something bad. They are only thinking that he's doing something good with a bad person. And that is the matter, that the idea that he informs the opposers. But at the same time, we cannot fail to try. We cannot be judged by the one who has not performed to the expectation, for purposes that we can now again sacrifice what is good at the altar of bias. So in my opinion, I can tell you that this agreement, having of course all of these into play, I am looking at Uganda beginning a new course of obtaining political maturity that will eventually and substantially deliver the transition that Uganda clamors for.
Okay, that was on the sections of the agreement that got you happiest. Now I want to flip the question. If there was one part of that agreement you would change as a vice president of the Democratic Party, which clause would that be?
Of course, that would be the clause on collective responsibility. But unfortunately, that is a clause that almost obtains across the board all over the world. That those that have accepted to become ministers in a government are governed by collective responsibility, even on matters for which they have not considered. Because the agreement allows the Democratic Party to espouse its own independent ideas in cabinet and vend them as ideas and opinions of the Democratic Party, restricted to the Democratic Party. At the end of the day, collective responsibility is on.
Okay, to the previous question, you said that this agreement helps strengthen the opposition parties. There are those who have argued to the contrary, that such agreements actually weaken the opposition parties, that the views of the Democratic Party, the views of UPC If NUP, for instance, made a similar agreement with the NRM tomorrow, the views of NUP would then be picked up and buried, and then the dominant view pushed, and that would be the NRM view. What do you say to such people?
Of course, that points to the low relative political maturity of the masses. Views and opinions are not espoused by political parties merely for purposes of antagonism. They are espoused as alternative procedures and processes of management of society that the people repeatedly choose to be governed under such opinions. Now, what is happening in Uganda, when you look at our constitution, for example, and I think somebody needs to run to article, I think it is Article 1 of the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda. I can tell you that the Constitution is extremely clear. Let me look at my Constitution here, because I have it.
I have it as well. Do you want me to read Article 1?
Yes, Article 1, particularly on sovereignty of the people. What does
Article 1:1?
Article 1:1.
All power belongs to the people who shall exercise their sovereignty in accordance with this Constitution.
Yes. Now, when you look at that provision, my brother, it presupposes that all power belongs to the people and that all people have got power. Now, when you keep power only in the hands of those ideally that have one government, you are generating a corridor of the powerless each time those other people belonging to your political party have lost an election and have no business in determining the direction of management of the country. That is criminal and unconstitutional. So political parties all over the world that seek to have opinions, even of the minorities included in decision making, have argued and established a basis of proportional representation. And I think that basis itself has generated a capacity capable that even those that are minorities have got a say in the management of the affairs of state. So when you look at that provision, that clause 1, power belongs to the people, but because the opposition for 35 years has kept its own people outside power, it has generated a corridor of the powerless for 35 years. Now, without their consent, because these people keep voting you in order to implement their opinions in the management of society. Now, when DP signs an agreement that has got a provision that all those provisions in the manifesto of the Democratic Party shall be enshrined in the manifesto of the National Resistance Movement, the Democratic Party has solved the first question of all power belonging to the people, at least for members of the Democratic Party. So in my opinion, those are things that we need to look at. The only problem is that people are failing to even determine, to even tell the population that it is not a democracy in Uganda when only all you are looking at is an election. These are things for which a political party must accept to be insulted, but become a protagonist in terms of establishing a level playing field over which a transition and holding of elections must have to be based. You cannot keep promising your people that you will win an election when you know that in an election people are shut down, in an election social media is shut down, in an election certain candidates are stopped from campaigning from certain regions. This kind of election does not actually denote a democracy. It does not. And I have been arguing with people to the of course, at the risk of being misunderstood for using a strong language, that an activity of an election of that nature, that is the subject of death and deadly contests, cannot be a determinant of a democracy. Instead, it is a determinant of what we call a democradula or a dictabulanda. In fact, the Mexicans call it the apertura democratica. It simply looks like when you are observing porridge in a cup, you cannot be told that the temperatures reflected at the surface of the porridge in the cup are the very temperatures reflected by the substantial thirst of the porridge inside the cup. So what is happening in Uganda requires now a new order. That order is called a transition. It must be a negotiated transition. Dialogue between all of those entities calling themselves political parties must also be ascertained. In Uganda, you have got registered political parties, but we don't have multi-party political dispensation. We have not had it. What we have is an entity, an outfit managing society, managing state, doing its very best to by way of authoritarian rule, stifle the operations of all of those entities calling themselves political parties. So in such a view, you cannot hold out the people's views by promising to win an election that you know you will not win. So the Democratic Party has done wonders. It is accepting. And by the way, when you look at, for example, the wording of Arthur Koestler in Darkness at Noon, Arthur Koestler wrote, and which is very interesting, that the ultimate truth is penultimately always a falsehood. That he who will be proved right in the end appears to be wrong and harmful before that end. Now, the Democratic Party that will be proved right in the end, today, it appears to be wrong and even harmful because we have not reached the end. But who will be proved right? Arthur Koestler writes that will only be known later. Meanwhile, he is bound to act on credit, sell his soul to the devil, but in the hope of history's absolution. The Democratic Party seeks to be absolved by history. We are taking decisions as saints. We can now be banned like saints, but I know for purposes of exaltation, monuments will be constructed later in our own memory for purposes of dying on behalf of democracy for Uganda.
Okay. Honorable, there are also those that say the Democratic Party is, while one of the registered opposition parties and perhaps one of the oldest, currently one of the most insignificant. It has just a handful of members of parliament, compared to, for instance, the Forum for Democratic Change and the National Unity Platform. The Democratic Party is nowhere able to fight their numbers, for instance, in parliament. So when you say all these things that you're going to lead to transition, you're going to lead to all these big things, does it then bother you that this is being said of a party that is not that significant? Or at least if the numbers are to communicate, are to speak, they would say that. If opposed, for instance, to the parties I mentioned earlier, does that as well bother you?
It doesn't, because first of all, the Democratic Party has never boasted itself over just having the backup of the number of those that do not know why they vote. Because in Uganda, we have a low relative political maturity of the masses. And because elections are not preceded by a substantial and robust degree of civic education, we know that the manifestation of a result of an election is not based on substantial knowledge by the voters. So to me, priding myself for having been successful in an election where those making choices did not know what to do, in an election that anyway people say are being rigged, in my opinion, the Democratic Party prides itself not in terms of the massive elections that are bestowed upon it, but for those other values that you do not find in any other political parties. One, the power of knowledge. The Democratic Party is actually punctuated by men and women that will go down in history as those that have been intellectual in nature, power of knowledge, value-based, and I can tell you, we are not a group of those people that are tainted with proletariat bandwagoning. You see, we have leaders that fear to take decisions, which decisions they know are actually correct, but because they want to be popularly correct. Now, if you want your opinion to be the popular opinion, and you know that the relative political maturity of the masses is so low, you are subjecting your own decisions to decisions of those that are ignorant of a matter they are deciding upon. You don't want the Democratic Party to be found there, and we are not part of that process. Therefore, we are not the subject of bandwagon effect. We are not the subject of a political party is only voted for by way of celebrity panjanduram. We are only voted for by those that have understood what we stand for in the equation. Since 1954, that the Democratic Party was formed, we have won elections, we have also lost elections. And for each time we have emerged from an election, our heads are high that we have maintained the highest degree of knowledge, of decision making, and of value-based candidatures. And that is what the Democratic Party stands for in the equation.
Okay, just a reminder for those that have joined us along the way, I'm hosting the Honorable Mukasa Mbidde, and we are slightly past the past 30 minutes into this discussion. At some point, we'll bring in the audience and you'll be able to ask your questions to the Honorable, make a comment, make a contribution, as long as you do so respectfully. The subject of discussion today is the Democratic Party and the NRM Agreement that was made a few weeks back. And we have the Vice President of the Democratic Party, who also doubles as one of Uganda's representatives to the East African Legislative Assembly, to address the questions we are putting before him. Back to you, Honorable. Let's flip and look at the other side. This agreement was made with NRM, led by President Museveni. President Museveni has amended the constitution twice. He amended the constitution in 2005. He amended the constitution in 2017. I was not that old in 2005, so I wouldn't commit to what happened back then. 2017, I was rather old, and I watched the Democratic Party coin the word Kojikwatako, spread this word, move around the country. Yet, in the end, still the constitution was amended. Does it ever bother you that you made an agreement with a gentleman that even an agreement as sacrosanct as the constitution does not stand in his way, and whenever he wants, he will amend it? Do you fear that your own agreement is easier even to amend in such circumstances?
I can tell you that that is one of the reasons why, if the Democratic Party is to work with you and you are President Museveni with that kind of record that you have adumbrated, then we must be the ones in charge of the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, for purposes that we can redress the wrongs that we feel were administered. I can tell you, and many lawyers think that a constitution is the grand norm. Now, which is not by way of jurisprudence correct. The grand norm is that the presupposition that the constitution should be followed. Now, when a country's constitution becomes a document, and the presupposition that such a document and all its provisions cannot be followed exists, then the constitution now begins to slowly lose the grand norm in it. That is where the Democratic Party now stands for in the equation. We think there must be now a fresh start. A start that is almost akin to the start that we enjoyed in Uganda slightly after independence, where now all countries were clamoring for what we call constitutional autochthony. That is where now we are heading as Uganda. We must now sit down and collect all opinions from all and sundry, and establish a level playing field, enact a constitution. That constitution must provide for alternatives and opportunity for all those with governance opinions to have such opinions interpreted into leadership by the choice of the people. And that is where the Democratic Party stands for in the equation. I can tell you, we are not blind, we are not babies, and the objects for which we have done what we are doing is extremely for the sole purpose that we must solve the wrongs, not that we must join the wrongs.
Okay, like I hinted earlier, there are members, including members of parliament of the Democratic Party, that have poured loads of aspersion on this agreement, and they've said they don't agree with it. They think the President General of the Democratic Party was wrong to enter in the first place. Some have gone public, called press conferences and all. How does the party intend to deal with these dissenting voices over that agreement?
Yeah, there is a reason why the Democratic Party is called the Democratic Party, and we have a difference. When you look at a political party and you really feel that in that party they don't have at all any divergences of opinions, There are no cataclysms like they exist in the Democratic Party. Then you conclude, and probably you could be right to conclude, that in that political party, only one person does the thinking and all the rest do the following. Now, that doesn't exist in the Democratic Party. All leaders of the Democratic Party are free to exercise free will, a free mind. And all of those divergent opinions are expected to be consolidated into a substantial opinion and beaten and whipped in line when organs that are available to solve such disparities have convened and have accordingly subjected their mind and will to such divergent opinions. What, by the way, is actually contrary to my submission is where now such are done in such a way that they occasion indiscipline. Now, indiscipline is not actually condoned by the Democratic Party. The Constitution of the Democratic Party provides for avenues with which you can solve all your problems, including the problem of indiscipline, by the way. What are the fears of members of parliament? The first fear is that members of parliament still accede and kowtow to the kind of political arrangement that makes them gallery players. Members that do whatever they do for purposes of appeasing the public gallery, in terms of for purposes that they can always be voted for, when actually people begin to think that they are still vending an opinion that they possess. That is number one. So anything to do with President Museveni, they quickly pull out their tool of bias, because that is the tool that is popular amongst the masses that voted for them. They think that is the tool that should be vended, other than the objects for which we need governance. Number two, I have seen some of those, I don't know whether they are lawyers or paralegals, vending opinions to the effect that members of parliament, by virtue of this agreement, will lose their own political seats. Now that is laughable. You are a lawyer, you are a colleague like me. We know how a member of parliament loses a political office. It must be by an election petition. That has been fortified by a lot of precedents. Sempamba Bali versus Attorney General, Sechikubo versus Attorney General, and this cooperation agreement does not have the effect of amending a Parliamentary Elections Act. I do not know where even lawyers can even imagine, with the highest level of a figment of fertile imagination, that a member of parliament can lose your seat merely because your political party has entered into a private agreement with another political party. I think that is preposterous, and they need to be guided.
Okay, I think you haven't really addressed the question I put to you. So, do you think that the Democratic Party will take any action against the members of parliament, like if I'm to mention a name, Honorable Baiga, who think that who have poured all sorts of scorn on the agreement that the party entered into?
Obviously, we are analyzing the concerns. I have told you that majorly their concerns are majorly a figment. The Democratic Party really will always take measures that are capable of resolving contradictions. You know that historically, the Honorable Lulu Mbaiga almost recruited people like me into the Democratic Party. He's senior to me in the DP. I joined the Democratic Party in 2000 from Makerere University. He was already a leader in the Democratic Party. The Honorable Lulu has been a Deputy Secretary General before and the Acting Secretary General of the party. He even organized the elections at Mbale, but when he sensed they are not winning, they ran away from the very elections they organized, and we came and won. We who were actually now being led by the Honorable Norbert Mao. To date, he has been making a multiplicity of attempts to lead the DP, but he has failed because the population think he has not really lived up to the task. So we are used to the Honorable Lume Baiga. He has since filed a multiplicity of suits against the Democratic Party. Those days when I was the legal advisor of the party, I won close to 38 suits and applications filed by him, either directly or by proxy. And we won all of those because the Democratic Party believes in truth and justice. Therefore, we know how to deal with him, and we shall definitely deal with him without necessarily causing any problem to him, because we know him, we are used.
Okay. The audience, the members of the audience, I've seen already Evelyn has asked for the microphone. I'm going to request that you just give me 15 minutes. I sum up, then I'll give you the chance to ask the questions, and then I'll come back later to wrap it up. So if you want the microphone, right now is the time to ask. Just press the mic icon that you see under your screen now. It will send a signal to me that I can then respond to and give you the microphone when the time is right. Going back to Honorable Mukasa Mbidde, are you going to run again for Iyala?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The Democratic Party has already come up with the candidate, and that is the Honorable Gerard Siranda, and we are putting our whole weight behind him. In any case, we have a 2-term limit in the East African Parliament, and that stops me even if I had the wildest idea to still continue to compete for the same.
Okay. You've talked so much about the issue of transition today, and I'm sure that very many Ugandans ask themselves that question. When you read newspapers, when you listen to the radios, it's always a part of the discussion. When do we transition? When do we move like Kenya is moving? When do we move like Tanzania is moving, and all this? What does the ideal situation of transition for you look like in Uganda?
Transition has got several clusters. And the first, the major item on the agenda must be the establishment of a rights-based political participation process. Now, rights-based is something that cannot be arrived at by one group competing to defeat the other. It is majorly arrived at by consensus. You know, when you look at politics, there are people that have interpreted and defined the politics. Chairman Mao Zedong, who actually is the namesake of my party president, Mao, once described and defined the politics as both politics in general and the politics with bloodshed. He defined and described the politics in general as the kind of politics that includes the elections and all and the sundry. And he said that when politics in general grows to a stage beyond which it cannot proceed, then war must break out to resolve the contradiction. Now, Uganda, if the Democratic Party did not take this step, probably had reached the stage where war was likely to break out to resolve this contradiction. Because if for 35 years, a contrary opinion has failed to administer state, to take power, that meant that such procedures and processes cannot deliver the change that is desired by the contrary opinion or by those vending contrary opinions. What therefore was incumbent upon those to do was to wage war for purposes that we can resolve then this contradiction. Now, when the Democratic Party, headed by the Honorable Robert Mao, chooses to foster dialogue as the major tool for purposes of establishing a transition, then what we are looking at, one, is the provision and establishment of rights. Two, the enactment of laws and rules that equally grant those kinds of rights to all those with political views, whether for or against the state. Three, the training. I am looking at people. Some of them are members of parliament. Others are even candidates vying to be leaders of Uganda. But I can tell you, to me, if they do not test the administration of state, at least by way of industrial training, you know, when one is appointed minister, to me, that looks like a clerkship for purposes of lawyers and industrial training for purposes of the other disciplines. I am looking at people who, if they were appointed ministers, they would one day emerge with a press conference against their permanent secretaries for refusal to koto or heed to some of the directives they have given. I can tell you, Uganda needs some bit of training in terms of management of state affairs. When you look at 60% of the members of parliament that we have in Uganda, and you look, for example, at the qualifications of persons to serve in the parliament of Uganda, not as members, those ones that are members of public service in the parliament of the Republic of Uganda, almost 60% of the MPs currently sitting in the Parliament of Uganda cannot qualify for the jobs that those people are doing in the Parliament of Uganda. What does that mean? The trust of the people is bestowed upon them, but as to whether they have the knowledge to champion state affairs, once they were given, of course, capacity to do so, almost looks like a logical impossibility. We need the kind of dialogue that is necessary to the extent that all those political organizations and outfits that call themselves political parties, including the Democratic Party, contribute to state formation, state administration, dialogue, to the extent that then we can evolve a future of a body politic of those that know where the state, by way of ideological orientation, can run to as a direction. It happened everywhere. It happened in Kenya. One would shudder. If, for example, the Honorable Raila Odinga had never been minister, if the Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta had never been minister, if the Honorable Ruto had never been minister, if either of those were declared the president of the Republic of Kenya, what would be their commencement point? They would definitely know nothing about state formation and running state affairs. So clearly, Uganda cannot be subjected to those that are using guesswork as their major experience, as their major tool in terms of administration of state affairs. One knows, and everyone, I think one would have to tell you, the general rule is that each step in a country's political development is a result of definite experiences. When you look at a country, you look at the experiences it has gone through, and that one will inform the steps that a country takes for purposes of resolution of its own problems. One would wonder if, for example, San Suu Kyi in Myanmar never worked with the junta. Even a series of some of the solutions that have been attempted in the circumstances, one would shudder whether we would arrive at the same. One would wonder, for example, if in Kenya, excuse me, if, for example, Kenya never, because there was a transition in Kenya, the first transition in Kenya, the major player was God, because he took the leader and the vice president assumed leadership. But you know what happened thereafter. If that leader was not also led into acceding to the formation of political organizations, and leadership of Kenya was left to the whims of his own decision making, what would happen? Because in the beginning, you know, and we all read, those of us who have had a lot of interest in, for example, African politics, you know that the protagonists of Kenya's political, especially towards independence and after, include Mzee Jaramogi Odinga, there was Njonjo, and the way the late President Moi played around with their own appointments, disappointment, torture, in terms of Dr. Like, Njonjo, and all of those. If Matiba, Kenneth, if they were not allowed to form political parties, including Mzee Mwai Kibaki, the history of Kenya would not have been what we are looking at here. Now, the history of Uganda needs to be rewritten. We have had one person leading a country for over 35 years. Clearly, his NRM party is not the institution, if you go to the polls, that you will be versing against. He himself has become an institution of himself. He has capacity, he himself, to also be christened a political party, he himself. Therefore, you are running with a multiplicity of political organizations established by him, and you are subjecting yourself to an election against such a multiplicity. When you look at, for example, the list of advisors, they are almost also outnumbering the list of cabinet members. When you look at, for example, the other arrangements in terms of security, he is the directing mind and the will of the army, the security, the public service, electoral commission, everything. If such is not tampered with, and you keep promising your population that after 5 years you are winning and you are going to be declared the winner, I think you are only being by Buncho and Chickenale as a person who is only keeping that population away from the administration of your country. The Democratic Party cannot control to that kind of mentality.
Okay, I am going to bring in the audience, but this is the final question. You've really done a great job of painting this agreement in the best light possible.
That's
Um,
where it lies.
okay, so the multipartyism returned to Uganda as far back as 2005. 2005, this is 2022, almost 20 years later. One would then ask a simple question: what took the DP so long to realize that something as good as an agreement with the NRM was all they needed? What took you this long?
Like I told you, that each step in an entity's political development is a result of definite experiences. There are new buzzwords that have been generated. For example, when they name the Electoral Commission of Uganda the Independent Electoral Commission, you cannot take that to the bank that it is independent. Accordingly, when political parties were freed to exist, you do not call that one multipartism. Political parties were freed to exist, they register, and they operate. The freedoms with which they operate is what you must use as a litmus test to determine whether they are really operational as political organizations. Number two, given the low levels of political maturity of the masses in Uganda, political parties are not supported by the masses financially to run. So if, for example, you allow all your children, you give them all opportunities in terms of supermarkets without anything inside, if you don't give them the necessary capital to run the supermarkets themselves, I think they will only remain in monumental structures given to your children without their capacity to actually trade. So in Uganda, the Democratic Party has been, it has not been adamant. We have engaged in a series of political activity. For example, in 1995, before even political parties were allowed to operate fully, during the subsistence of the infamous Article 269 that established the NRM as a system of governance. And by the way, I can tell, even before I go into that, the Democratic Party has been championing unity of the opposition political entities. The Democratic Party participated in the Interpolitical Forces Cooperation, IPFC 1995, that led us throughout the 1996 elections. The Democratic Party participated in the IPC that led us through the 2001 elections. Those were not political parties per se, but we knew what we were doing. When Dr. Besigye left the army in 2001, the Democratic Party, or at least those subscribing to the Democratic Party, supported him heavily to take power. The Democratic Party has been consistent in formatting and fermenting unity of opposition political parties. The Democratic Party participated and was a protagonist in the establishment of TDA, which was also a substantive political entity that was, of course, designed to champion a unit of political parties so that we can defeat the NRM party or government, whichever is applicable in the circumstances. That did not also yield substantial results because certain other political parties reneged from participation in the, and that was during the last moments of the participation in the TDA. The FDC took off, vended their own candidate, and emerged number 2 in an election that was equally also obviously visibly rigged. The Democratic Party participated in the championing of unity of the younger people of the Democratic Party, dubbed the Uganda Young Democrats Reunion. The Democratic Party, under the leadership of the Honorable Norbert Mao, funded even that process. That was the process that vended the Honorable Robert Chagulanyi and handed him over to the population. By the way, against some of the leaders of the Democratic Party as the possible leader and the president of Uganda. Since then, he has never gone back. He has consistently even formed his own political organization, the NUP, and it is now the leading opposition political party in the parliament of Uganda. I can tell you the DP has not slept. Now, what should the Democratic Party do? It must take a popular decision. The DP will always continue to take popular decisions, but it takes possible decisions. What did you do? What is a popular decision? During the last general elections, obviously, 2 political parties were voted for, majorly. And that was the National Resistance Movement and the NUP. So if the Democratic Party is to cooperate, taking a position that is popular within the meaning of the word popular, then it must cooperate with either of the two. Now, that also is incumbent upon the objective reasons that make it a logical necessity for the Democratic Party to cooperate. Now, if you are cooperating for purposes of constitutional amendments, for purposes of, for all and sundry that were provided in the agreement, then the alternative was supposed to be a cooperation with the NRM government. And we are happy that the NRM also kowtowed to this kind of cooperation, that in any way is not inspired by, for example, the numbers that the Democratic Party has, but the brains and the values that the Democratic Party stands for in the equation.
Okay, we are exactly at the half, at the 1 hour mark since we started the discussion. That means we've been here for half the time intended to be here. So I'm going to call for questions from the audience. All you have to do is ask for the microphone by pressing that microphone-like icon at the bottom of your, I think it's bottom left of your screen. Then I'll be able to give you the microphone. So we already have Evelyn who asked for the microphone earlier. Evelyn, what do you have to say? Evelyn, you may want to unmute and then communicate whatever you want to say. Evelyn, are you there? Okay, looks like Evelyn is having issues with her microphone. So if there's anyone else that has a question, a comment, an inquiry, or call it whatever you want to call it, please just ask for the microphone and I'll give it right to you. Now, as we wait for that, Honorable, I want to come back to you.
Yes, sir.
When I was at the university, Makerere University, a few years back, the Uganda Young Democrats (UID) was the place to be. They literally swept through every election. I have never had a party card in my life as a Ugandan. I came very close to having one of the Democratic Party. Going back there to Makerere University, I was there last week for some other issues, and then I discovered that seems the Uganda Young Democrats is no longer what it used to be. The elections seem more and more in favor of newer players like NUP. What do you make of that?
The historicity of the formation of the Uganda Young Democrats also generates the kind of status that you found out about the Uganda Young Democrats. Uganda Young Democrats started, I think, way back in 1995. I hadn't yet joined the Democratic Party. But it was an outfit that was hinged to the Democratic Party at a time when political space was not guaranteed vehemently for political organization. At a time during the subsistence of Article 269 of the Constitution of Uganda that only allowed what they dubbed the National Resistance Movement System that eventually culminated into the NRM Party, only to play, to be political players in the circumstances. Therefore, it was the target. It was standing at a pillar. And if anybody wanted to see what is high up in the sky, what you would look at is only the Uganda Young Democrats. Now, it was started by the younger people of the time. I can tell you that they had a world of opportunity to be visible because they were the only players in the field of politics or politics. Today, there is valuable and virtual competition. And I can tell you that the politics of Uganda is not aligned per se to political organizations. And I told you that where you have got an arrangement that is authoritarian in nature, the country is organized in a dichotomy of majorly two official political sentiments, those for and those against. And that those against will always be behind anyone who is fresh and actually is seen as the one carrying the banner of opposition to the entity, the establishment. What you are seeing is a subject of a lot. Is a subject of a lot, but majorly it is subject to the kind of freedoms given to political parties, the kind of capacity given to political parties, and the notion of politics that obtains in the country.
Okay, I also tend to take this unconventional, if I may call it that, view that Ugandans, or perhaps could even stretch that to East Africans, and if you really stretch it wider, maybe Africans, don't even believe in parties that much. In the run up to the 2021 elections, we saw a whole horde of members of parliament from the Democratic Party cross to the newly formed National Unity Platform. Oft times we see MPs in parliament taking decisions that are contrary to their party position. The party supporters, like many of them, even with party cards, never contribute anything to the party. They are indifferent depending on who is contesting. If it's their friend or someone they hate, they are likely to cross party lines and vote for a person from the other side or a person from this side. From what you've painted today throughout the discussion, it's this: DP is a strong party, NRM is a strong party, we have parties existing and things like that. Do you get the same view that Ugandans probably don't even mind these parties? These parties are probably not even important to them when serious decisions are being taken. Do you get such a feeling once in a while?
Of course, I do, and it is unfortunate. That informs again the object for which the DP has entered into an agreement. You cannot run a country if the clusters of political leaders repeatedly wanting to run a country have no ideological anchor chain. That means that a country will occasionally be run by opportunistic and flower garden theorists that each and every moment only begin to vent opinions that they think are popular with the population. There will never be a serious entity that can provide the necessary growth and the development of Uganda and the people that is required. That members crossed to the NUP. I think this country needed to also study something that is new, that happened to the political arena in Uganda. Ugandans had somebody who is an artist, who is talented, and he had funds. Now, when he turned the funds into political supporters, that was something incumbent upon all political actors to study. That is not politics. It is called political panjandram. It is a celebrity. Now, that celebrity status that eventually culminated into political support is instead what drove most of the members that only needed to win an election. My president usually refers to this as milk card politics. Ugandans have resorted, after failing to remove President Museveni, have resorted to thinking that holding a political office is actually a job in itself. And those that wanted and sought to maintain their jobs quickly ran to that party. Not that they believe in the ideologies of that party, if any, by the way, at the time, because it was a new party. And clearly, I do not know of any delegates' conferences where they sat and began to coach ideologies that ran it. But it was an entity that had a driver. Now, the driver drove. And what these people that crossed were only following is what we can call the proletariat bandwagoning. They were only following the multitudes of those that were supporting the protagonists so that they would win an election, which indeed they did. So crossing was opportunistic in nature. It wasn't informed by any ideological decisions that would have obtained at the time, if any.
Okay, I am rather surprised that there's no request for a microphone and no one is interested or expressing interest in asking a question yet. So I'll repeat that this is time for the audience, and we are really open to having any question from anybody. Perhaps there is something that you want to put to the Honorable in relation to the subject of discussion. Just request for the microphone. Quickly, I'll hand you the microphone, and then you'll be able to ask. Evelyn had earlier asked for the microphone. She was granted the same and then dropped off. And now I see she's back. Evelyn, in case you're still interested in asking a question, just request for the microphone the way you did earlier. I'll be able to give it to you, and then you will say whatever you want to say. Now, I unfortunately, Honorable, I have to maintain you as no one is expressing interest. So you mentioned earlier and said preparedness, people have to be ministers. You pointed out the examples in Kenya, and I thought of it and I was like, this is actually true. even if you look at President Museveni in the between 1979 and 80, he was already a minister here serving and all that. So I probably agree with you that training, what you call the internship, use that legal, the word that lawyers use, apprenticeship, makes people better leaders. Does that then unfairly advantage the NRM as opposed to all the opposition parties, given how many ministers NRM has worked with, has appointed, has groomed over the years? Do you hold that view? So, for instance, the DP now will have Honorable Norbert Mao.
Yeah.
Compared to NRM's so many, probably hundreds of ministers, if you move back to 2005 and started counting them. What do you make of that?
It wouldn't. I would like you to look at NRM, because it is also not really a political party to which people belong, simply because they are ideologically in belief of what it espouses. But I want you to look at President Museveni and the NRM as a person who is actually rearing cattle in a playground. The traditional, for example, if you would look at the traditional Mulalo, who is rearing cows and cattle in a playground that don't effectually belong to him. Usually what happens is that on the way back, each and every cluster of cows will then begin to stray back to its own playground, to its own homesteads where they belong to. The NRM is today hosting a multiplicity of several party memberships that belong to the Democratic Party, to the Uganda People's Congress, to other political outfits, that if it were now opened for free and fair political competition, these people would not stay in the national resistance movement. I would like you to look at KANU, for example, as it then was in Kenya. You know that even Raila Odinga had at one time become the Secretary General of KANU, when he actually also administered some kind of intersection. Now, when he left, and Moi even immediately appointed Mr. Mudavadi, a vice president of Kenya, for close to 58 days. I can tell you that today, the former KANU is now a laughable political organization, because when the freedoms ensue, I would like you to look at this like a zoo. If you have watched animals in a zoo, have you watched some? They are caged animals.
Yes, I have.
Yes, they are all caged animals, and all of those visitors that frequent the zoo will keep giving them. The monkeys are fed on bananas, the lions are given pieces of meat, and the leopards as such. But if you want to know the value of freedom and where each of the animals would like to belong, just open the cage and see what happens. They will never remain, despite the fact that they have been fed well. So freedom is usually preferred. And when freedom, in the eyes and the vicinity of freedom, that is where man and woman now will begin to locate their own permanent stature. So I can look at many people right now in the NRM that will quickly belong to the Democratic Party once freedoms are established pursuant to this cooperation agreement, and a process that shall be led by the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs once it is done.
Okay. The other question is that the NRM as a system, and with all the people it works with, so we have Honorable Norbert Mao now as the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs. But then you have all these other people, all these systems, all these red tapes and balances. How will that affect the agreement with the Democratic Party? So, for instance, under the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, there are other ministers who are not necessarily members of the Democratic Party. Will the position of the Democratic Party always prevail if Norbert Mao, for instance, if Honorable Norbert Mao, for instance, said he wanted something, and the NRM members also of that ministry said we wouldn't go with that, it affects our party? Whose position would prevail in such a situation?
First of all, my brother, you need to look at what are the objective conditions that have made it necessary for NRM to even deal with the Democratic Party in such a manner that has never been occasioned before. I can tell you that the Democratic Party, and particularly now the Honorable Norbert Mao, who is a member of cabinet, I want you to look at him as an expatriate in NRM. An expatriate and of course in a manner of an expert also, is that person that once consulted will give you an expert opinion, and he will not need to mobilize you in order to actually kowtow and accede to that expert opinion. If an expert tells you that if you use such bricks and this type of cement, certainly your building will fall down in a record period of 9 months, that person does not need to mobilize you to accept the expert opinion he has given. And I want you to look at the Democratic Party by way of an expatriate with expert opinions that has joined the cabinet to generate that expertise and foster a new country order that we want to deliver. So it is not going to be about popular vote. It is generally going to be about expert opinion. If a doctor tells you that you must have the diagnosis is in such a way that parts of your body must be cut off, he doesn't need to corrupt you or even bribe you into accepting. If they tell you that one of the limbs has to be cut off so that the cancerous cells must be stopped from spreading to the heart, it is up to you to take that kind of advice, and that is not anything that can be subjected to a popular vote. That is going to be the role of the Democratic Party in this circumstance.
Okay, I get that. Still, no one has asked for the microphone. Evelyn is right here, but she hasn't either. I would really want to get the views of those people that have been listening in from the start, and to ask them that if there's any question you really want to put. I see Adong Sharon. In case there's any question you want to put to the Honorable, in case there's any submission you want to make, please feel extremely welcome. Feel free. Just ask for the microphone, and the Bible says, "Ask and it will be given unto you." So I'll do the same and give you the microphone to ask any kind of question that you want to put, provided, I insist, it's respectful and pertains the decorum of such a debate. So, Honorable, I'm going to get back to you. I'm now going to veer off our topic, and I'm going to look at Iyala. We have elections for Iyala in a few months from now. So, how significant is the position of Iyala, and how much importance, or how important is it that we have opposition members on as part of the people that represent the country at Iyala?
Yeah, of course, I will begin with the requirement, the need that opposition members also are included as a part of those elected to represent Uganda to the East African Legislative Assembly. It is a requirement of the law, first of all, particularly Article 50 of the Treaty for the Establishment of the East African Community, that for an election to be conducted, participants and those that will actually vie for election should be representative of the political parties represented in the National Assembly, shades of opinions and special interest groups. So that is actually a given. It is a treaty provision, and anything to the contrary is accordingly contrary to the treaty. That is one. Number two, it is also incumbent, because when you talk of a community is that kind of geographical location where actually the people they are in do each and everything together. Now, if community refers to those espousing opinion and the representative of those very persons that emanate from such a community, it is really incumbent upon such a community to be, such a parliament to be reflective of what actually is the reflection of persons back home where such representatives are sent from. In terms of the relevance of the East African Legislative Assembly, it is generally as relevant and as important as a legislature for the East African community. What probably the listeners need to know also is that integration, and particularly the East African community integration process, is a negotiation still ongoing. The ultimate end and aim by the framers of particularly the 1996 tripartite agreement that eventually culminated into a 1999-2000 treaty for the establishment of the East African community, was to ultimately establish East Africa as one country for political purposes. But it was divided into majorly four limbs. The first limb being the customs union. Now, East Africa, at least for customs purposes, is one country. East Africa, for purposes, for market purposes, in terms of the East African Common Market, is one country for market purposes. East Africa is not yet one country for monetary purposes, but processes are underway and verifications and benchmarkings have been done for purposes of establishing the probable interoperability of a common a monetary union. But in terms of a political federation, where we are going to look at East Africa as one country, I think that one is yet to be identified. Establishing a federation includes ceding power. In Africa, and particularly East Africa, we still have leadership that don't want to cede power even to their own children. We know that that is something that we will head for, and once that is realized, I think we shall be in heaven. The ultimate aim of the East African community, by the way, by the framers and protagonists of this integration process, is a creation of one African country, which starts by way of regional economic communities that federate into a single country, and such clusters ultimately culminate into creation of the United States of Africa. So I think a legislative body as IALA, which is the East African Legislative Assembly, for purposes of those listeners that are not aware of what it is to legislate and make sure that all protocols entered into are generally reduced into laws that are applicable, either self-executing or benchmark laws from which partner states can enact laws that are applicable in the circumstance.
Okay, Innocent, do you have a question? I've already given you the microphone. Please unmute and ask.
Thank you very much, host. Thank you very much, Honorable Mukasa. So my name is Innocent. I'm speaking from Kigali, Rwanda.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure following your discussions here.
Thank
so
you,
first of all, let me thank Honorable. I remember when our two countries were not in good terms, you stood along the Rwandans who were suffering in the hands of people who wanted to take advantage of the situation by then. So I really wanted to thank you for that. Now that the countries are back, the politics are back to normal, we can now enjoy the relationship we have with our brothers and sisters in Uganda. We thank you very much for that. So my second is my question. I think that can build economic, the politics of Africa and particularly of this region. So I wanted to hear the views of Honorable. One is, of course, you mentioned about it. I remember when I joined this discussion, I heard you talking about the building the institutions. The very thing that, if I remember well, President Obama mentioned when he came during his first visit on the continent, when he became the president. That was, I think, in Ghana. He argued Africans and African presidents to build strong institutions other than strong people, strong leaders. So that is one. I think you mentioned it. But the second I want mostly your views on is on the building the maturity in our politics. I've never seen in developed countries, I've never seen opposition people going to the streets, burning and destroying infrastructures, demonstrating and doing, messy stuff. The kind of things I see here in Africa, every opposition is so synonymous with violence and burning stuff and destroying what was already built, what people have tried to put in place. So how do we start to build that, politics that, however much you disagree with people in the government or the political parties in the government, but still you have a respect of what was achieved, of the efforts that was put in place, the infrastructure, the peace. How do we build that general consensus among the people to
Yes.
respect that kind of, respect for what is already in place? I don't know if I made myself clear on that one.
Yes. Certainly you have. Yes, Innocent,
Yes.
you have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes. Moderator, would you wish that I answer that?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Innocent has tickled me into an area that I had not looked into. This area is popularly referred to as it is a long word, consociationalism. Now, this is an area that develops and eventually culminates into the growth and development of a national spirit. Now, in Uganda, for example, the death of a national spirit is where persons or individuals, whether they are regarded as minorities, feel that they are not, or their opinions are not being recognized. I can tell you, we have not run short of examples to benchmark from. For example, Innocent has called me from Rwanda. When you look at, for example, the Constitution of the Republic of Rwanda, and particularly Article 10 and 62 thereof, you find that there is established the kind of proportional representation in governance after an election that stops anybody from running to the streets in the event that you have you have lost an election. Why? Because the Constitution establishes that one, a political party that actually takes government does not produce the Speaker of the House of Deputies. So the Speaker of the House of Deputies ultimately now comes from the opposition. Number two, that a political party that obtains that has got the majority in parliament does not actually take more than 50% of the positions of leadership in cabinet. Now, you really find that by way, of course, and of course, we are looking at the 80-53 that I elect, and of course, the women. When you establish now a kind of leadership that looks at all and sundry, including the minorities, you cannot have work to work after an election, because clearly government is formed commensurate with the amount of weight that you have emerged with from an election. When you look at, for example, other countries like Burundi, for example, if Burundi kowtows to the ideals of the 1993 Arusha Agreement in terms of power sharing, that recognizes majority, minority, and all of those that would otherwise have not been recognized were they subjected to a popular view. The 60-40 power sharing deal, 60-35 and 5, you can always see that a country of that nature can obtain the kind of consensus that builds the national spirit, that stops anybody from burning a building merely because you have lost an election. So these are things that are actually African born, that should be emulated by all of us once given an opportunity like the Democratic Party has been given to espouse opinions that can run Uganda to the best heights possible.
Okay, there's no question coming up. No one has at least asked for the microphone. So I'll put this question to you. For quite some time, Honorable, some people accuse the Democratic Party of being the sick man of Uganda's opposition, if I am to use that phrase used by Metternich. They said it was where the malls were. They accused the party president of so many things that I wouldn't want to repeat myself here, and I'm sure you know them. Then when the agreement was signed, they were like, this exposes what we've been telling you all along. They felt like they were vindicated. Now, do you think the Democratic Party will still find it any easy to work with the other opposition parties? After all, if the agreement notwithstanding, the Democratic Party is still a part of the Uganda's opposition. So doesn't the agreement jeopardize your relationship with the rest of the opposition?
I think at all times we must be guided by honesty. If you believe that government X can organize an election where votes shall be counted by persons it has appointed, guarded by an army it has trained and it pays salaries too, and that you will compete and contest in that election under the promise to your electorate that you will win and even form government, then in my opinion, you are only being hypocritical if you begin to think that you should maintain the same view of the same kind of bias against such an agreement. That is, to me, a fallacy that we must not agree with. The Democratic Party has been accused of a lot of things. The other time when I joined the DP in Makerere University, a colleague of mine rang me and he told me that you have joined the dead party. Now, I told him that unless death is our style of life, the Democratic Party is not a dead party. However, we are not a party that can pass for an activist political organization without question. We are a party that regurgitates political opinion until we emerge with a substantial amount of decision making applied to it. And that is where we fall and follow. The Democratic Party is older than all of us now leading it. I suppose, at least looking at the president, Honorable Norbert Mao and myself, we are leading a party that is older than us. That cannot be taken for granted. The meaning is that it has values that we found and that must be nurtured. The Democratic Party is not actually it is not one of the rebel, it does not conduct rebel activities. Ugandans, and particularly our political leaders on the opposition, have been extremely hypocritical. I think at most they have coached people's views in terms where they do not now hold the difference between rebellion and opposition. Now, opposition is first of all a recognition that you are an alternative to what exists. And that is what now the Democratic Party understands. We have political entities that want to behave and pass off as opposition during the day. I mean, as rebel groups during the day. But then they kowtow as opposition at night, continue to exchange views, ideas, and pleasantries with the status quo, as if that is actually not what they believe in during the day. Now, the population has been taken for granted for so long. The Democratic Party is that party that if it intends to meet the President of the Republic of Uganda, they do so during the day. And if they are to agree with him on any material decisions that should be taken, they do so in writing. However, they are political parties that have consistently and continuously maintained contact with the president. And we only get shocked when memberships of such political organizations are appointed to positions of authority, and before you know it, they have even crossed now to the national resistance movement as a party. The Democratic Party doesn't do that. The Democratic Party has been assessed by a method of the body politic that we employ, and that is liberalism. We can guarantee you that if you achieve on a matter, the Democratic Party will point out that achievement. And if you fail on a material delivery, the Democratic Party will still, in the same breath, point out that kind of failure. Accordingly, those that intend to champion a political dichotomy in Uganda in terms of the status quo, and those that pass off as if they are actually vehemently opposed to a level of disgust. Those that want to indicate to the population that when you talk about the NRM, then it is something you have talked about that is so obnoxious, fetid, acrid. But when actually they have maintained the contact at night and undetected, the Democratic Party is not a trickster. It's not a group of those tainted with the chicanery. It is a group of intellectuals that can maintain an ideological anchor chain and emerges with the decisions and aspirations for the future of Uganda, while mindful of the historicity of the political trajectory of the country itself.
Honorable,
yes, sir.
if I call it a claim, the claim that some members of Uganda's opposition work with the state during the night and then come and pretend during the day, it has been regurgitated for so long, it's always being said. I think it will carry more credibility if you could mention, for instance, and tell us that such and such a party, such and such leaders in these parties do this. Do you have the liberty to do that right here now?
I wish it was necessary, my brother. I would do it. But I can tell you, I can tell you that what is not necessary is working with President Museveni at night and indicating to the population during the day that it is foolhardy working with the President of the Republic of Uganda. The moment you join opposition, indirectly recognizing that there is a government that is legitimate and legal in a country, you accede to the fact that that government should pay you a salary, and you must admit that that salary is out of the taxes paid by those, including those that never voted for you and those that voted for him. So, for me, I do not think it is an offense to work with President Museveni. And accordingly, pointing out to those that work with him, I find it rather preposterous. What I think we must do is to administer a robust procedure for civic education that intends to inform the country that a head of state does not lead for himself or his party, but this is a person that operates using taxes paid by those that even never voted for him, to accordingly maintain that at all times he cannot lead the country without opinions espoused by us that never voted for him, because in any case we equally pay taxes over which he runs the country. We can no longer make sure or indicate to the population that leadership of Uganda is a preserve of those that have been declared winners of an election that we think has been organized on premises, as we have always popularly said, that are not free and fair. So that is going to be, we are going to establish, and our accession to an agreement with NRM is a beginning of a new chapter in the politics of Uganda.
Luanga, you have a question to ask?
Yes. Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Honorable.
Welcome.
I want to thank the moderator for the call. My question goes straight to the Honorable. I've grown up hearing and seeing Honorable Mbidde on TV and radio, and usually he has always been a person that is leaning to the ruling party, that is the NRM. And my question is, Honorable, I see you in support of the agreement between the DP and NRM, but I want you to tell us, to be honest and tell us, is there anything that that DP is going to do that can change the president? Because we've seen people try out, tell the president about governance, but he's always saying no one can lecture him about politics and governance in Africa. The area Kategai has tried, the Mama Babas have tried to negotiate, and many other people. So I want Honorable to be honest with us and tell us, is there anything that he thinks that DP is going to do that can change the president? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I think the Democratic Party is organized on a premise that success is not obtained by never falling, but rather it is obtained by how many times do you come up each time you fall. That a few people have failed to reach where they should have reached in the circumstances of, for example, changing President Museveni, does not inform that the Democratic Party will equally fail. That is number one. Number two, management and leadership of Uganda is not the sole preserve of President Museveni. If you leave management and administration of the country to President Museveni, certainly he will lead and manage it the way he has always done for the last 35 years. And for you to expect a change without a contrary opinion being delivered to him, to me, you begin to look like one man who was found climbing a mango tree And when he was asked why he's climbing a mango tree, he said he's looking for oranges. When he was told that actually it is impossible that oranges can grow on a mango tree, he still insisted that is why he's coming down. Now, we cannot have a body politic of a whole country premised on whether or not somebody supports a specific kind of leader. It must always be hinged on whether or not a specific group of people organized in what is called a political party are vending a specific opinion, a specific ideological anchor chain. Let me tell you, let me give you examples. Because you see, the politicians in Uganda, first of all, the reading culture, my brother, you must admit that the reading culture in Uganda is extremely so low. In fact, if war broke out in Kampala here, one of the safest businesses that cannot be looted is a library. If you ask people why they have not looted the library, they will say there is nothing, just books. So in Uganda, we have got a body politic, a group of persons vending opinions on governance that are ignorant of governance itself. And they think that they will be given the ambit of leadership of Uganda merely because they have shouted themselves hawks that they want one to go and they come in. They don't take steps calculated to obtain leadership. No, they don't. You'll find most of them evenly distributed in all the bars of Kampala at a time when the one they seek to remove from office is actually still meeting people and campaigning. We can no longer have a country that is kept in a campaigning mood for 5 years every after an election. We now want a Uganda that can now be put on a development path in order that we can have a country that is good both for us and for those yet unborn. So the brother that has posed the question, I didn't understand him, but I don't know for how long he has known me, but if you have known me between 2000 and now, I have been a member of the Democratic Party and I have not reneged from the objects for which I joined it.
Okay, unfortunately, that was also our final question from the audience. Since they are not asking for questions, I am going to call the discussion to a halt. But before I go, I am looking at my computer here, and my candidate in Kenya, who happens to be Wajakoya, is performing very terribly. I don't know, would you mind telling us, Honorable, who your candidate, who your preferred candidate in Kenyan election is?
You know, I got a very huge problem taking a decision on which candidate to support. Until one candidate reached out to me, I was given roles to play through for purposes that we can foster his election. And that candidate is the Honorable Raila Odinga. So clearly, because I am serving interests of that candidature, I am fully behind him and I wish him well. However, in the event that he does not make it, I think I am not one of those people on the list of those that will commit suicide. I'll still remain happy that Honorable Ruto has also won.
Okay, at least your candidate is faring well. Mine, Wajakoya, we are almost getting an attack. And the final thing is about your command of the Queen's language, English language. Throughout the discussion and throughout interviews that I have had the opportunity of watching you give, you use these words that even for a lawyer, I am a lawyer myself, but sometimes when I hear you speak those words, I get scared. And I think you went to a different law school, yet we went to the same law school in reality. How do you do that? How do you get these words? How do you play about with them and all? In case there's anyone who wants to know that anyway.
Yes. First of all, I have had role models when I was growing up. I come from a very humble family. I never went to any of the schools that are known. I came from Kaboko, joined the Kampala High. I've been to Masulita. Those are schools that cannot really be on the list of those that are high sounding. But I've had role models. I kept myself reading newspapers. I have admired people. There are people who were my role models. They became mentors. And now we are working together. And one of them is Honorable Batmao, incidentally. People have been asking why I am always with him, even when we disagree. It's because I started as a secret admirer. I admired most of his speeches and the witticism with which he presented himself, even on matters that were so deadly. One of